I am Ollie Hopkins. I'm psychologist at Balance and Birch. I work with neurodivergent people, people with chronic illness, people with complex PTSD, and then I do a lot of work with grief, kind of as the result of all of those things. With the people that I work with, oftentimes what I see is that for my neurodivergent folks who get the late in life diagnosis, there tends to be a lot of grief around identity, and grief around loss of like quality of life. So when you get a later in life diagnosis with neurodivergence, you tend to kind of look back on life and like reconceptualize everything through the lens of, oh, that's because I was autistic or had ADHD or one of the other neurodivergencies. And there's this feeling and thought of, if only I had known, if only the adults in my life had known, or my teachers or caregivers or whoever, my life would be different. And so there tends to be a lot of grief. And then there's also grief over the fact that you come to realize that for some people with certain types of neurodivergence, you can't do the things you had wanted to do, or at least not in the way that you had wanted to do them. So there's a lot of sadness and grief comes with that. And within grief, there's anger, frustration, rage, heartbreak, all of that. And then chronic illness is similar. When you get that diagnosis, or when you know you have a chronic illness, even if you haven't gotten a formal diagnosis, there's a lot of grief around missing out on life, especially for people who are, I'm 33, so who are around my age or even younger, where it's like, okay, well, I'm in my 20s or 30s, I should be able to do all of these things that you see people doing who aren't chronically ill, but then you're just stuck at home. You also have to grieve the loss of friendships, grieve the loss of relationships with family members, because a lot of people don't understand with chronic illness that it's not a lack of trying, it's you're just disabled. Um, so there's a lot of that. And then there's also, I work with grief in terms of what a lot of people think of about grief, with loss, like loss of loved ones. I have several, like, several clients I've worked with throughout the years who have experienced that. I worked with veterans and there was a lot of grief there, that they had experienced. So I have, since I was a child, experienced emotions very intensely. And one of the ones that I experience most intensely tends to be grief. Um, and I've just had a very interesting relationship with it throughout my life. So that's a long explanation for why I wanted to do a podcast and talk to as many people, in the practice as I could about their experiences with grief. So I'm just kind of hoping to get Iesha and Jen, like your experiences with grief, whatever that definition is for you, whatever that looks like for you, if it is like physical loss or a loss of a relationship, even if the person, is still here, could be the loss of a pet, it could be loss of health, or, you know, there's something I didn't mention. Also, immigrants and refugees, there's a lot of grief over loss of like culture and access to their homeland. So there's that type of grief as well. And that isn't just with immigrants and refugees. There can also be loss related to within the United States of having to move to a different place or a different region, for any number of reasons. So loss of connection to where you're from. Um, yeah, so I'll go ahead and give you guys the floor to introduce yourselves and, really just, again, whatever you'd like to talk about related to grief and your experiences, I'd love to hear about.
Who would you like to go first?
I'll go first. I didn't realize I was unmuted, but hello again. My name is Iesha. I am the trauma informed somatic yoga instructor for Balance and Birch. Typically, I work with individuals who are neurodivergent or consider themselves to be neurodivergent, as well as individuals who have been impacted with some variation of trauma. And so the individuals that I work with tend to deal with anxiety, stress, a lot of chronic pains, So trauma that shows up in the body. I also work with individuals who have disassociated from their bodies because of either their trauma or their realization or them actually learning that they are newly diagnosed with neurodivergence. I work with adults as well as children. And yeah, so that's my approach. My approach is trauma informed and somatic. So that's my work. When it comes to grief, Ollie, you mentioned that there's several variations of grief, and there's a lot of different ways that we all experience it. What came to my mind was number one, the grief of um, raising a child who is autistic and having a certain level of expectations as a mother when I was, pregnant with him, even before, his diagnosis and everything, just having a certain level of expectation of how I was going to raise him, um, you know, reaching those different milestones, at 6 months, we're going to try these foods. At one, we're going to start walking. In actuality, it was none of that. The reaching those milestones didn't come as I would have liked for them to be. So, just going through those adjustments on a day to day basis with him has been a sense of loss or grief for me and my family. But then I also think about when it comes to grief, um, career wise. So I went to school and got a degree in pre law, and I wanted to be a paralegal. And so I started out working out of school as a paralegal and realizing very quickly I did not want to do that anymore because corporate. I have a love hate relationship with the corporate world. And so I realized that number one, I wanted to be a stay at home mom. And then two, I wanted to do things my way that didn't necessarily align with corporate values. So I think about that when it comes to grief. And then lastly, when it comes to grief, I think about connecting with my ancestors as an African American woman, ancestors who originally came from Africa to the United States. I think about acknowledging them in a way that for me has connected to me and my values and the way I live, my morals and things like that. So I think that understanding that background with my ancestors and creating that connection with them, as well as learning my true history, the history that's been covered up, and not really taught in schools, and just really taking that initiative to really be privy to that type of history, my history. And it also serves as a level of grief for me because I'm not 100% sure of everything that my ancestors have went through and everything that's, been covered up in history. And so I'm doing currently my due diligence to figure out, my different lineage, my African heritage, and which tribes I've come from, and just really learning their way of living, and really tapping into that so that I can incorporate that respectfully into my own daily living. So there are several ways that grief has shown up throughout my life, and I love, Ollie, that you have really brought this to the forefront and allowed us to come together and speak about this because it's a topic that needs to be discussed, and a lot of people a lot of times don't really understand how it ties into our mental stability, even our lifestyle. So thank you.
That was so beautiful. And I love that you both touched on like a vast array of different ways that grief can show up because those are absolutely all valid. Now is the time for me to introduce myself. I am Jennifer Lee. I am the Reiki practitioner with Balance and Birch, and I really focus on overcoming trauma, which will then lead to grief. And trauma can form at any stage, whether it's childhood trauma, it can be, trauma and grief from losing your job unexpectedly. It could be, that type of trauma or grief from getting out of a long relationship that was pretty much your whole world. So those can form at different stages, and it doesn't always have to be childhood trauma, but I'm very trauma informed and I heavily focus on overcoming the blockages that keep us stuck in that, trauma mentality. And I know sometimes we go back and forth where we'll be doing great one day and then we'll, kind of what I call like a little relapse and go back and have a meltdown the next day. But when I experience trauma, and the reason why I'm so passionate about it is when my father passed away unexpectedly when I was 11, and I witnessed him die, and it was very confusing. It was very traumatic, and I really didn't know how to move forward. And not only did I feel grief and sadness from that and confusion, I also felt abandonment from my own mother as well because she was unable to take care of me and my brother. So we were sent to live in multiple family members' homes, and some of them were really wonderful, and some of them were physically and mentally and even spiritually abusive. And that's another form of grief is to deal with that type of abuse because you think, like, oh, I deserve this or, like, what's wrong with me? So you'll go back and forth and you will kind of go in this circle thinking, like, what did I do? So I really carried that trauma and those abandonments and the grief along with me throughout my 20s. And then I realized, like, okay, well, I'm not going to move forward from where I am right now if I don't do something about it because I knew that I would not last much longer if I did not take action. So that's when I decided I wanted to heal from my own grief and my trauma. And I decided to do Reiki and therapy and crystal healing, yoga, essential oils, and all of that other kind of stuff too. And that led me to handle grief a little bit better as like I move forward. However, it still hits you strong, but I didn't go through a 10, 15-year cycle. So, I have been hit with a lot of trauma. Not only did my father pass away, but I've had friends pass away. I've had my grandmother and my grandfather pass away, who were my dad's parents, who actually were in the process of trying to adopt me and my brother when we were younger. So I had that strong connection with them, almost like my other parental figures. And I have had other, family members that, were not as close as that immediate family members pass away, but dealing with those were extremely difficult. But, processing the grief, and learning how to move with it instead of against it allowed me to kind of, I don't want to say heal quicker because I could literally just break down and start crying right now because I still feel that pain, but it allows me to process it and be okay with the grief. Sometimes just knowing that it's okay to feel the way we do is just enough for us to move forward. So that's the way that I took my trauma and my grief, and that's the way it resonated so deeply with me. But again, like I mentioned, I loved all of your examples because those are absolutely all valid. And there's so many different ways that grief can show up in our lives.
Yeah, no, I that's something that I've learned, I think, since becoming a therapist. Is prior to being a therapist, I think I thought of grief in terms of physical loss. So like in primarily losing family members. Um, and it was really interesting because for a very long time I invalidated my own grief because I hadn't ever really physically lost anybody close to me. Um, and so I saw all these people around me who had lost family members, friends, in either to old age or illness or something tragic. And I was like, there was the grief inside of me, but I really couldn't put a name to it eh, because I was equating grief to something, more clearly defined and concrete. Which I think is partially me being autistic and being very like rigid and black and white with my definitions of emotions. But I think it's also societal. That like your grief is not valid if it doesn't meet certain criteria. Um, and only once I became a therapist and really started to get to know dozens of different types of people did I realize pretty much everyone is carrying some form of grief, whether or not they realize it. And it, like both of you pointed out, it can show up in so many different ways in so many different areas. Um, Iesha, this keeps coming back to me, and please let me know if you're not comfortable talking about this. I'm very interested in learning more about um, the like cultural practices that you have been exploring and learning about and like what those are. Um, and I know that's like that's not like I guess I don't know. I guess it's kind of talking about grief, but it's interesting how grief can lead to so much exploration and connection. So I would love to hear about that if you're open to sharing.
Yeah, for sure. So when you think about the events that's been happening in the world today, right? You start to, at least for me, I start to question, okay, so our leader is clearly stated our leader is not a person for African American people, and he's shown that time and time again. And so you start to question, well, how important or how much how important are is the culture, right? As far as African American people. So I start to so many questions start to develop in my mind, and I'm like, okay, well, let's go back to as far back as I can. So let's start brushing up on history and really start to learn, where things like racism or patriarchy or sexism, where it started when it comes to the African American community. Um, so it's almost like a deep dive into that type of background. And then you get to a level where you get curious about, okay, so what triggers those things, the racism, the sexism, and all of that? What triggers it in the Caucasian or, you know, people outside of our race? What triggers them? Like what makes them hate African American people or dislike African American people so much? And you start thinking about their ancestors and their the people, their lineage. You start thinking about their culture, and it's like, okay, so you start just coming up with different questions. So long story short, because I don't want to go into like a deep explanation, but I wanted to go back to the beginning and really brush up on my history and understand why or how certain issues that are in place today, how they've shown up before in our history, because they say history repeats itself. Um, I want to validate those ancestral practices, and I want to validate myself as an African American person. So I want to start practicing some of those practices. For instance, learning about different herbs, herbal medicines. What are some natural herbs that come from the earth that is healing for African American people? Even essential oils, the different types of essential oils that are healing to us, as well as I also pull oracle cards. So really learning about the oracle cards, and on top of that, just calling upon my ancestors So I have an altar, and on my altar, there are my oracle cards as well as different obituaries from my ancestors. And there's a specific prayer that calls to my ancestors so that when I meditate, I can hear them clearly. Um, and really just, go off that for now until I learn a little bit more. But that's how I am slowly really understanding what's happening in the world today and how history is repeating itself. Because going back into history, a lot of the things that's happening today has happened several times before, and really just understanding the basis of it, so that I can know. I know it's like it sounds really deep, but so that I can know personally for myself how I can respectfully practice those practices that my ancestors have set in place, as well as be open to hearing my ancestors when they are communicating with me. Does that answer your question, Ali?
Yeah, I
I
really appreciate you sharing that. Go
okay.
ahead. Sorry, were you gonna say something else?
Sorry about that. I felt like I just went through like a deep dive just now, and it was kind of like a bit choppy, but I hope that I came off um what I wanted to come off. I hope that it came clearly. Did I answer your question?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, to me, it felt very clear actually. Like, and I like you said, like something effective, like I don't want it to seem too deep, and I don't want to speak for you, but like to me, it feels deep and it feels important to acknowledge that depth.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, I mean, everything you just said is I I often and I think I've expressed this. I think I've expressed this to you, Aisha. Jen, I don't know if I've said this to you. I often feel things that I can't put into words. And as you were speaking and explaining all of that, there's this very strong like like admiration, love, warmth that I was feeling. Um and I don't know how to explain it. It just yeah, what you were saying is just it matters. It's so important.
You don't have to explain it. I get it. I get it. Yeah, it is very important. And it wasn't until very recently, maybe a few years ago, where I really realized how important it is to me, especially now since I have kids. I want to instill some of those practices in my kids, even, meditating and calling upon the ancestors so that you have that inner voice outside of your parents. But it is very important.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing, Aisha.
You're welcome.
Yeah. Um Jen, if there's more that you would like to share, like more in depth about any of the areas you've touched on related to grief, I would love to hear about it. Um, I also know that like this is a podcast that many people are going to see. So like not everyone wants to share about like the deepest depths of their grief in a way that other people are allowed to bear witness to. So yeah, if there's anything that you feel comfortable expanding on, I would love to hear.
Yeah, I think that when you said like grief, that like we have this like mentality that grief shows up in like a certain way, like it needs to fit inside this box. And it's so not true because there are so many different feelings that you can feel associated with grief. There's that anger, there's depression, there's anxiety, like suicidal ideation. There's all of that that comes along with it. And I think it's very like underrated because if like, oh, they're going through something, oh, they're sad. Like that's the label that they put on there. Like, oh, they're just sad. When in reality, you feel everything so much. And you were just talking about like you're very empathetic. Like you have that empathy within you. And I feel like that we all do, the three of us for sure. And like when I was trying to process, I didn't have anyone to help me. Um, like Iesha, I'm actually an immigrant to this country too. My family's from Panama, and I'm the first one to be born in the United States from my dad's side. So, us talking about our feelings is not something that is very like big. Like we just kind of keep it inside ourselves. But honestly, I was struggling. Like when, like my father passed away, I was struggling. I needed support, I needed security, I needed safety, and I needed understanding because I was very young trying to process it and understand it. And I thought it's like, well, maybe there's something I could have done. Maybe I could have, saved his life or something. But I started putting the blame on me, and like I felt a roller coaster of emotions. And I think that, when people are going through grief, whether it be, from someone passing, losing a job, just trying to find a new identity because they've been diagnosed with something, I think it's important that we are very understanding to whatever they may be feeling, and not just say, oh, they're just sad, oh, they're just going through something, because there's so much underlaying that could happen underneath the surface. And honestly, I was severely depressed. I became an alcoholic. I turned to drugs. I have suicidal ideations. I've even tried a few times, and obviously unsuccessfully because I'm still here now. But it's just there's so much that goes beyond the word grief. Like there's so many different emotions that can come from it, and not everybody feels the same thing. So, I mean, some people may feel really angry, some people may be feeling really depressed. So, I think it's really important that we acknowledge that, grief can come in many forms, it can come in many feelings. And, I think it's important for us to just be understanding that we need to be supportive if somebody is going through something. So, yeah.
That also makes me think when I was learning more about, different types of trauma healing, people say big T, little t, and that's very controversial because I think trauma is trauma. And whether it's big trauma or little trauma, it's very impactful, especially in the body. Um, but the different variations of trauma, whether it's a car accident or experiencing um, death of a loved one, that would be considered big T trauma, and then little T trauma would be something like, I don't know. It's very hard for me to give an example of that because it's all trauma. But a small T trauma would be something like, I tore my meniscus last year and I went through a state of depression, and now I move differently when I'm practicing yoga, right? So it's very there's a fine line between it, but trauma is trauma, just like how grief is grief. So it's very similar.
Yeah, actually, and that makes me want to add on to that. Trauma can show up in different forms of our body. It may not just be like mental or emotional. It could be physical, because you mentioned car accident. I was in rear-ended twice, and I have like bulging discs in my neck. So that causes a lot of trauma. And the way that it associates to grief is, sometimes it'll trigger my migraines more. And I'm like sad for like the times that I'm like, oh, I wish I was feeling better. Or remember the times when you didn't have migraines. So I think that it come in different forms too.
Yeah. Yeah, it definitely can. And Aisha, like just to speak to what you were saying about big T versus little T trauma, um, it's interesting because as a therapist, that is just like ingrained in your brain when you're learning about trauma work, like big T versus little T. And it's interesting because we're taught that big T matters more than little t, but little t over time culminates into big T. And also, interestingly, I learned this relatively recently because only within like 5 years of being diagnosed as autistic. And all of this research about autism is just, it's booming right now because people are finally paying attention to it. But what a non-autistic person experiences as just a stressor, an autistic person can experience as a big T trauma. So like big T or little t, there's no objective way of even categorizing that. Like I remember uh one time I had it was like a wasn't really it was a relationship, but it wasn't, but it was very abusive and very traumatizing. But the person one day texted me. We lived together, but he was traveling. He texted me and told me he was going to go hang out with someone and used a very specific emoji. Um, and I didn't think anything of it. I trusted this person. I didn't hear from him for hours and hours and hours. Turns out he was not with the person he said he was with, and he was effectively cheating on me. And I couldn't see that emoji without having a full-blown panic attack moving forward. And I had people tell me that's ridiculous. It's just an emoji. But for me, it was abandonment. It was betrayal. It was manipulation. It was a complete it was the loss of a relationship. Even now today, when I see the emoji, I still think about it. I don't have the reaction because I've used the emoji so much. I don't have the same emotional reaction. But it's like a lot of people would be like, oh, like the emoji itself, like, yeah, like that's, I get how you would remember it, but that's not that big of a deal. But for my body, it would just set me off if anyone ever used it. So it's just grief and trauma and lived experiences are so incredibly subjective, and it's really sad that humans do not give each other much grace when it comes to suffering and pain. um I've had many clients I've worked with come to me and they're grieving someone or something, and they've said, people in my life tell me that I need to get over it, like losing a child. And they still have up, pictures and everything the way it was when the child passed, and they're like, yeah, my friends tell me it's been a year, I need to take that down, it's like a shrine. And I've, always been like, you keep that up as long as you need to. Like there is no wrong way to grieve, there's no right way to grieve. Like you have to do what you have to do to make it through that loss. And like, yeah, like one of the other reasons I wanted to do this podcast is because this is around the 6 month mark of when I lost my dog. She died September 13th of 2025. I had her for 11, like it was 11 years and exactly 1 month. And I got her when I was 21. And if, you're older than 21, like your upper 20s or 30s, you know that 21's not very old and you're still pretty much a kid. She was with me through the messiest years of my life, and she saw me through just the worst trauma and abuse and just major changes and fear and grief and all of that. And so to lose her, it wasn't just losing my soul dog. It was like this moment that signified like saying goodbye to some amount of childhood or that closing that chapter of my life, and like knowing that I could never go back and get a redo on those 11 years that were so painful. um in fact, I'm actually I'm in my bedroom right now, my old bedroom where she used to sleep with me. In 6 months, I've only slept in this room once. It was the day after she died. And I had to move my mattress to my husband's bedroom because I just cannot sleep in this room without her. Um, she was an 85-pound German Shepherd. Like, how do you get used to sleeping without that massive Velcro dog next to you? Um, but it's interesting because a lot of people will say like, "Oh, it's just a pet." But like, she was my child. She was my best friend. Like, she was everything. Um, I'm getting choked up even saying it. Like, Jen, you mentioned, you were like, yeah, I'm hesitant to say like I've healed from it because I could break down right now. And most days I don't cry about having lost her. But the other night, my husband and I had an interaction, and I had this feeling of loneliness. And loneliness is very common for autistic people. I mean, it's common for everyone. It's not that only autistic people experience it. It's just that it's felt very strongly in autistic people because we have a hard time connecting with and communicating with other people in a way that makes us feel understood or that allows us to understand them. So loneliness accompanied by grief is one of my earliest like pain points, I'd say, which is, where my relationship with grief started. Ada, my dog, was a turning point for me to not feel lonely anymore. And so my husband and I had this interaction, and he helps me not feel lonely. But we had this interaction where I felt very invisible and therefore lonely. And I was just like, so not only was I hurt by that, I then had this feeling of, oh, if Ada was here, I wouldn't be lonely because she would be with me. And it's so interesting, the ebb and flow of that. How, like, this one emotion, it just set off this cascade, and I sobbed for like an hour straight, just like wailing. Because I was like, it was this realization almost that she's gone. And so this being that helped me feel like I wasn't going through life alone isn't here anymore. So if I lose my husband for any reason, I'm alone again. That's scary. And I think that's another component of grief is like that felt absence of that person or relationship or health or whatever it is. There's a hole there. Like, and you feel it. It's just a really interesting experience to be able to feel the absence of something. Yeah, that was kind of tangential, but yeah.
I'm glad you got it out, Ollie. I'm curious to know though. You mentioned that you really can't go back, to the 20s, when you and your dog were together and built that relationship together. You're right, you really can't go back, but I'm curious to know, are there ways in which you try to not relive, but um, go back to certain memories where you can do things that you and your dog may have done together, like go to a certain park where you can reminisce about your, memories of you and your dog, or eat a certain food that you would share with your dog, or are there certain things that you can practice or go back to that remind you of those moments that you have with Ada? And if so, are those moments for you, are they healing? And do you find that you kind of get over that grief a little bit faster at all?
It's a really good question. And it's something I feel like Jen and I touched on. I did a few Reiki sessions with Jen after Ada passed. I did some hypnosis with Allie too, because it just like I'm a therapist and I love therapy, but I was in therapy for 13 years, and there was just a point where I was like, therapy isn't going to touch this. This is like there no amount of therapy can get down to the level of loss that I'm experiencing. So I had to do something else, and Reiki was so helpful, and so was hypnosis. But something I think that Jen encouraged me to do, which I've struggled with, is like let the emotions flow. Um, and like there definitely have been times where like um in sense like doing the sessions with Jen, I have been more open with myself about letting myself cry or acknowledge the grief. But something I haven't done that I avoid, and it's I've noticed recently, so it's interesting you brought it up, Iesha. I've noticed the avoidance recently. Um, I one day recently told my husband, like, I'll just say like the grief is heavier today. That's kind of how I explain, like it's just one of those days. And he was like, well, like oh, like, why don't you go read to Ada? You know, because I have God, I also I hate crying just because like it gives me headaches and it's exhausting. But this is supposed to be like unfiltered, so I guess I should cry if I need to cry. I have an altar to Ada. It's so elaborate. I've spent thousands of dollars like memorializing her. And something I gave away a whole bunch of her stuff to a shelter when she died because I was like, I want other dogs to be able to use it. And we had a lot of really expensive things that I thought the shelter could use, but a couple things I couldn't get rid of were her beds. So one of her beds sits at her altar. Um, and every so often I'll sit on it if one of my cats is laying on it, but I will not sit on it and talk to her. I think it's because we spent so much time alone when I lived with her. I would just talk to her like a person. Um, and she was a German Shepherd. She was so smart. So me talking to her like a person, she learned so many words. Um, and I talk a lot. So I think it's like I'm scared. I'm so scared to go sit and talk to her or go to those places we used to go or even just like go sit in my backyard and just think about her. Um, because then I have to face the fact that she truly is physically gone. Like gone. I will never see her again in this lifetime. And like I can't wrap my head around multiple decades without her when I spent some of the most important years of my life with her. Um and so the answer is there are things I could do to connect with her. Um but I think I very often am just kind of trying to like get through the day without losing it. Um, and some days I do just lose it. And that's not to say I don't let myself feel the grief or cry because I do, because it feels like it would be a disservice to her and like my love for her and our relationship if I didn't acknowledge that I was heartbroken over the loss of her. But it almost feels like if I were to do the things that she used to love, or I were to sit and talk to her or read to her, um, or just sit at her altar, it feels like I'm going to fall into the hole of her absence and not be able to pull myself out. Um, yeah. Does that answer your question? Oh, you're on
That
mute, Aisha. Oh, you're not
I'm
now. You're good.
I'm still in,
It
okay. I was saying thank you for sharing that. That makes a lot of sense completely. And it may take time, you know, it may take time to get there. But I love the fact that you have an altar for Ada. That is amazing. Because you have a go-to place where you can connect with her in your home, um, that's safe and she knows that she can show up there and you'll be there. So I love that. That's amazing. But definitely give yourself grace because I think it may take time for sure. I personally have never lost an animal and or a dog or just I don't mean to make it sound like, you know, it's not just a dog, it's somebody who was a part of you for sure. And I've never experienced that. And so I think that it's almost like a child. It can almost be like a child because Ada has grown with you and you've connected with her throughout such an important time in your life, where you weren't even a fully grown adult yourself. And so I think that you all have that special connection. And when you do decide to reach out to her and want to connect with her from the other side. I think that she'll be ready. She'll be waiting for you. But I do love the fact that you have that altar for her, a place where you and her can kind of meet in the middle when you're ready. So thank you for sharing that. That was very sweet.
And can I just add that there is no time limit to your grief? I mean, you may not be ready now to do those things, but it doesn't mean or discredit that you're not healing or that you're not moving forward, because some days are going to be okay and you can, go through the day without, breaking down, but some days you're going to cry and stuff. And just because you have those bad days does not mean you're healing, and it's okay to take the time that you need. And I say screw anyone that says that you have to get over it, or you have to heal faster, because grief doesn't like grief is not in time, like it'll be a part of you. It just won't hurt as bad, as you move forward.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's definitely a lesson I've learned is it changes form. Um my I used to when I had relationships and experience grief very strongly. And I had one of my previous therapists like describe grief to me as like it's a ball in a jar, and at first the jar it occupies is small, but as time passes, as you have other experiences, the grief stays the same size, but the ball gets moved to a jar that's slightly bigger, the bigger jar representing more lived experiences. And so it's not that the grief ever goes away or change like necessarily changes size or shape. It's that life changes. And then like I guess your relationship with the grief can change. So I loved that imagery, and it's really helped me make sense of what I'm feeling, and just kind of accept like Ada was always there from the day I got her. She was always there. So I'm always going to feel that she's not there. And I heard someone explain animal grief being unique in that with animals, they like, especially animals that tend to follow you around. And she was a Velcro dog, so I get up to go to another room and she's like, all right, I guess we're going. And she would always follow me. So it's like constant memories of the apps. Like at the stove cooking and she's not sitting there begging for food. It's dinner time and all five of my cats are running around, scream meowing at me, and she's not sitting there begging for her dish. Um, so it's these. I don't have my dog sitting there staring at me in the bathroom. She's like German shepherds love to do that. Um, but yeah, it's just interesting. It's I the person I adopted her with. Um, this is so interesting. Sorry, now I'm getting tangential again, but like kind of stream of consciousness. I called we didn't really have a relationship anymore. He was the person I lived with where it was a very abusive relationship. Um, I will say there was a lot of grief there, but also a lot of forgiveness because I think a lot of his abuse was from her hurting or from him hurting and having his own wounds. So I'm hoping he's healed. But the only relationship we had for many years was just me sending him updates about Beta. He always wanted to know, how she's doing, and he always was willing to send money if she needed financial help for medical things. And he sent me a fair amount of money to make sure that her last week of life was as comfortable as it could be. But I called him the day I realized I needed to make the decision to have her euthanized, and I found out he had cancer. And it was just this crazy, and I had just come back from MJ's wedding. It was the day I got back from MJ's wedding. I went to go pick up Ada, took one look at her and realized that's it. She's not gonna have meaningful life anymore. And so I called her dad, and was like, hey, this is the situation. And something he said that I really loved, was grief is the cost of love. Um, and when you frame it that way, it feels so worth it to be grieving. Um, because like that is all the evidence I need that she was real, that she mattered to me. Um, yeah, yeah. I that was just such a powerful phrase. Yeah, really complicated time to be feeling grief about him having cancer and not having a relationship with him. It's just life is crazy. The way things line up sometimes. Yeah. Well, did either of you have anything else to add about your own experiences with grief?
No, I'm just over here trying not to cry.
I cry constantly. I'm a huge crier. I cry at everything. How about you, Aisha?
No, I don't really have too much more to share. I think we touched on a lot. We did, and it was really great connecting with you both and learning a little bit about you both because, like, like we all said in just different variations, grief just shows up within us in so many different ways, whether that's through the mind or through the body. But I think it's very important for us to take it at our own pace while still giving ourselves grace because it's a heavy thing to endure. And I think just taking it one day at a time is really all we can do. And just really offering ourselves that love and grace. It's just, that's just it.
Yeah. Very well put.